Hello, students. Welcome back to Mr. Lawhon's AP European History Notes. Today, we're going to finish up our Chapter 8. In Chapter 8.5, we talked about the American Revolution, what caused it, how it all played out, and how it all came to a crashing end. And today, we're going to talk about things going on behind the scenes during the American Revolution that also played a role in the American Revolution happening and how it played out. So our essential question today, 8.6, what role did British politics play in the American Revolution? Here's that politics words again that we've talked about so many times in class. And today we're going to kind of dive in and see what I mean by politics. So pause if you need to, and let's get started. Okay, behind the scenes of American Revolutionary era, all right? Behind the scenes of the American Revolutionary era. All right, you guys know what I'm talking about. So let's really quickly discuss some of the foundations of the American Revolution. And I don't feel like I did a great job of talking about this so far, but I do believe when we talked about the Enlightenment, I told you these ideas are going to lead to the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but we'll get into that in the next chapter. So ideas driving the revolution came from a lot of different places. It wasn't just the Enlightenment, although the Enlightenment is going to play a role. But there are other ideas floating around in the American intellectual's mind, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. All of these guys that are going to write during the American Revolution, there's all kinds of ideas floating around in their mind. And let's talk about the obvious ones, the Enlightenment. So if you think about Chapter 9, the last chapter, which is, remember, out of order. If you think about Chapter 9, the Enlightenment laid the foundation for kind of questioning absolutism, all right? I mean, if we go back, John Locke, technically a little bit before the Enlightenment, but I still consider him an Enlightenment guy. John Locke is going to talk about the idea that everyone's born with natural rights. And those rights are life and liberty and property. And if a government ever takes away those rights, then it is that government's responsibility to overthrow and make a new government that will protect those rights. Now, later on, when the United States writes the Declaration of Independence, we'll read it in class, and you're going to see that we took a lot of John Locke's ideas. We changed John Locke's life, liberty, and property to everybody has the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And very much just like Locke, we say in the Declaration of Independence, our government, if a government ever takes away those rights, we got the right to overthrow it and make a new one. But another idea is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea of the social contract. And basically, the idea of the social contract is the governments are able to rule with the consent of the governed. Now think about this. What does this mean? Well, it means, guys, who gives the government power to rule? Under the old age of absolutism and divine right, it was God grants the kings power to rule. But here, the idea is very different. The people being governed give consent to the government to rule them. I blow my students' minds when I tell them in discussing this idea, I ask them, who gives me the power to teach? And some of the students say, well, the district, they're the ones that hired you. Or some say the principal, he's your boss. And you know what the real answer is? The students give me the power to teach. I teach with the consent of the students. Because if the students wanted to, they could rise up against me and make my life miserable where I would not be able to teach in class. And guys, if every single student did this, I would have no power to stop it. And pretty soon, the people over me would come in and say, what's wrong with your class? Why can't you control your class? So once again, it is the students and the consent of the students that I'm able to teach. So look at it like that. Why does our government have the power to rule? Well, we give it to them. We let them. Think about it. If all the hundreds of millions of people in the United States all stood up at once and said, we are not going to be ruled by our government until these changes happen, and we all agreed on those changes, there's nothing the government can do. What are they going to do? Kill us all? No. We'd get them out of power. So anyway, that's what it means, rule with consent of the governed. Now, there's some other ideas going along with these ideas floating around inside the minds of American intellectuals. And another thing was the English Civil War that happened about 100 years before this. Now, you might be like, oh, Lahan, I remember talking about the English Civil War, but I don't really remember what it was all about. Well, remember, the English Civil War was all about these Stuart kings that were these new kings. Remember the Tudors, Elizabeth and Henry? They all worked together with their parliament, right? But the Stuarts came along, and they were of a different line of ancestry, and their whole idea was divine right. So you had this struggle between Parliament and the king. Now, why was there this struggle? Because the king did not want to keep doing or keeping the classical relationship that they had of working together with Parliament. They tried to do things without Parliament. If you remember, the Stuarts tried to raise money without Parliament and raise an army without Parliament. And traditionally, that had always been Parliament's rights. So, colonists viewed their struggle very much like Parliament's struggle against the Stuarts. They said, look, the king and Parliament, in this case, is trying to undo their relationship that we've had with the colonies. What relationship was that? Salutary neglect. Yeah, we all kind of understand that we are British citizens, but you kind of leave us alone and let us govern ourselves. So in a lot of the minds of Americans, they believed that George III and Parliament were trying to dissolve that former relationship that they used to have, just like the Stuarts were trying to dissolve that relationship between Parliament and the king working together. So the English Civil War was very much on the minds of Americans during the American Revolution. But there's one more thing that was on the minds that I'm going to talk about briefly. This group of people in Great Britain called Commonwealth men, all right? Now, who were the Commonwealth men? Well, guys, long story short, they were basically British writers in the 1700s that wrote some pretty radical literature that criticized Great Britain. They criticized corruption in Parliament that we're going to talk about a little bit later. And like I said, some of their ideas were pretty radical. Now, you might think, well, why didn't the British buy into these radical ideas if these are British writers? Well, in Great Britain, guys, the average citizen kind of felt like they were in a really good situation. And when they read all of these ideas from the Commonwealth men, they kind of blew them off as radical. But in America, radical is kind of what rules the day. And Americans would take radical literature and say, look, this is the truth. This is exactly what's going on. So the problem was perspective. Americans really had the perspective that the Commonwealth men had, that the British government was corrupt and there was no going back, and the only way to solve the problem was to break away. But in Great Britain, like I said, the average citizen that could read and that was into politics looked at these guys as kind of radicals. But they did influence the minds of Americans. Pause if you need to. Okay, now, I want to stop right here, guys, and I want to throw a definition at you, and I feel it's important to take an entire slide just to give you this definition. Why? Because we're going to talk about this definition for a very long time. Throughout the rest of the year, you're going to see this word creep in and out of governments and politics throughout the rest of the year. So that word is patronage, a patron, all right? Now, go back to the Renaissance. What's a patron? Well, a Renaissance patron was like a wealthy merchant or a noble or a bishop, and what they did was they patronized or they gave money to artists. All right, they said, look, I want you to do this. Here's the money. And those artists, like, Michelangelo would paint the Sistine Chapel. Okay, patronage. You relied on a wealthy, powerful person to give you money, and then you pretty much did whatever the wealthy, powerful person wanted to. Well, the idea is kind of similar, except we're going to apply that to government. Patronage in the government is this: the power of someone or a group of people to control appointment to office or the right to privileges. So, guys, here's the deal. Let me give you an example. Right now, King George III appoints who gets to get certain offices in the king or in the government of Great Britain. All right. And whoever he puts in office is going to kind of enforce his will. All right. So it's the power to control appointments, but it's also the right to give privileges that come with those appointments. What's a privilege of being kind of a homie to the king? Well, the king gives you jobs maybe you're not qualified for. Okay. The king maybe gives you a little money under the table to make sure that you get things done. Remember, we talked about King Louis XIV and how he bribed his nobles out in the countryside that didn't live in Versailles in order to keep and enforce his will. That's patronage. Okay, you are being given money by a wealthy, powerful person to do something. Now, what's the problem with patronage? Well, guys, it leads to really corrupt people in government that are appointed by the king. And these guys will do the king's will, even if it's not in the best interest of the government. Why? Because the king's giving them money, or the king's giving them a special privilege or a special appointment that they aren't really qualified for. So they have privileges. Now, guys, patronage is what really ruins a lot of governments. Pause if you need to, and let's give an example of how patronage is going to help lead to the American Revolution. Okay, what's really going on, guys, and this is something that a lot of classes won't talk about unless you're in a European history class. Let's talk about the American Revolution, what's going on in Great Britain, okay? Because we know what happened in the United States. What's going on in Great Britain? Well, guys, there's a secret war going on between George III and his own parliament, okay? This struggle. Now, let me give you some background. Do you guys know how our Congress has two houses, right? We have a Senate. Every state gets 2 senators, and we have a House of Representatives where basically every state gets representatives based on the number of people in their state. For instance, California has the most people out of any state in the United States, so therefore we get a lot of representatives. So there's 2 houses, a House of Representatives and a Senate. Okay? And they all kind of work together and they have different roles and responsibilities, but the main job of Congress as a whole is to make laws. Now, Parliament is very similar. Why? Because we kind of modeled our Congress after British Parliament. Parliament's got 2 houses too. They've got the House of Lords and they've got the House of Commons. Now, the House of Lords traditionally was made up of old, wealthy nobles, that had this long heritage of being nobles. And the House of Commons, originally, guys, were like knights and lesser nobles, but by the 1700s, it's more and more wealthy people that are not these old nobilities. Sometimes wealthy merchants and, people that we would call burghers or bourgeoisie, they're going to get elected, all right? But basically, they're not these old nobles, okay? Now, traditionally, think about where the power struggles have been. Go back to chapter 7. Who struggled for power in European nations? Well, the nobles and the king struggled for power, right? Because nobles had their traditional privileges of controlling their own land, and they always want autonomy, and the king wants to control everything, right? So there's a clash between those guys. But there's also a clash between the nobles and these new wealthy people, these burghers, right? These guys that rise to power and they've got a lot of money and they want more influence. Well, the nobles want to keep their prestige of being nobles, so they don't like these upcoming people with lots of money that are not even nobles. So here's the deal. Lots of times, in order to control the old nobility of a country, the king would go behind the old nobles' back and become buddy-buddy with these new wealthy people. All right, these new wealthy, not noble people, these burghers, these bourgeoisie in France. All right. So the House of Lords, like I said, was mostly made up of these old British noble families. And the House of Commons was made up of wealthy, kind of new money, burghers, merchants, lower level nobles that didn't have a lot of power that were elected to Parliament. So, guys, here's what happens. King George III and the old nobles are struggling for control of each other. All right. Why? Well, guys, it kind of goes back to the Stuarts in the Civil War. You see, guys, King George III wanted the power to appoint his own royal ministers, all right, and control his own royal ministers because they kind of guided the government. And what happens is, basically, King George III pulls a lot of his ministers not from the old nobility. Okay, not from people that would be in the House of Lords. So he kind of goes around the House of Lords because he wants to keep those guys under control. All right, and he elects these not old nobles. All right. So anyway, that is one of the things that's going on, and the old nobles are kind of mad. All right. George III had most of his supporters in the House of Commons. Why? Because he gave special privileges to them, patronage. Many members of the House of Commons were being bought off by King George III. Why? To keep these old nobles in the House of Lords kind of at bay. So if you think about it, there's almost like a civil war going on between George III and his own parliament. It's George III and a lot of people in the House of Commons, not everybody, versus the House of Lords. And during the American Revolution, there's this power struggle going back and forth. All right, now, aristocrats in the House of Lords didn't like all of this because their power was diminishing, right? They wanted to appoint old nobles to be the King George III's royal minister and kind of keep King George III's power in check. And like I said, George III wanted to choose his own personal advisors and ignore the aristocrats. So basically, if we really look at it, it's this old situation that we've seen since chapter 7, these old feuds between European nobles wanting to maintain whatever power they have and powerful kings trying to reassert their power. Was King George III trying to become an absolute monarch? Not really, but he was trying to increase his royal power, and he didn't like his royal power being checked by this powerful old nobility that were in the House of Lords. So if I had to summarize, basically look at it like this. King George III and the House of Commons, many of them are in it together against the House of Lords. All right, now, what does this lead to? Well, guys, remember, it is Parliament that controls laws and legislation and policy. So King George III has his homies in the House of Commons, and they block many things that the House of Lords would like to do. Kind of like if people in the Senate, like Democrats or Republicans in the Senate, blocked Democrats or Republicans, the opposite party, in Congress. It would be a stalemate, right? It would be a side where neither side wins, okay? So that's what's going on. King George III is trying to check the power of the House of Lords, and he's got his own little homies stationed in the House of Commons that he patronizes, gives them privileges and money. Now, like I said, that leads to a very corrupt government. And here's the thing. The Americans know this is going on. They know Parliament's divided. Pause if you need to. Okay, now let's talk about this guy named John Wilkes, all right? So a great example of this that shows in Americans' mind that the government is corrupt, the British government is corrupt and needs to be rebelled against, is John Wilkes. Now keep in mind, all of this is going on before and during the American Revolution. Okay, and that's why all of this going on behind the scenes is going to influence the American Revolution. So like I said, John Wilkes is going to serve as evidence of House of Commons corruption by George III. Now, how does John Wilkes' story get started? Well, John Wilkes is elected to Parliament, and he's a member of Parliament. And in a British newspaper, guess what? John Wilkes criticizes George III's minister. His name is Bute. I forget what his first name is, but his last name's Bute. All right? And how he handled the Treaty of Paris in 1763 that ended the French and Indian War. He gave him some little criticism there in a newspaper. And I forget what the newspaper was called, but I know it was issue number 45, and I'll show you why I know that here in a little bit. But anyway, he criticizes. Now, think about one of the ideas about the Enlightenment, freedom of speech, right? If the government's doing something corrupt, if the government doing something wrong, you ought to be able to call them out on it, right? Well, guys, guess what? The king and his royal minister didn't really like John Wilkes criticizing him and their policy, so Wilkes was arrested. Now, later on, they found out that there was no grounds to arrest a guy for criticizing the government, so he was later released. But George III got his little cronies in the House of Commons to vote to expel John Wilkes from Parliament. So the House of Commons, under the direction of Wilkes, is expelled, and he fled England. Now think about why this is a problem. Do you guys remember back in the Enlightenment, we talked about Montesquieu liked the British government because power was divided. The king is kind of like an executive branch. He enforces laws. Parliament makes the laws. And the idea is you don't want one of those branches of government taking over another. Okay? The king should enforce laws in Great Britain, not make them. But here's what's going on. The king is trying to control the law-making body. According to Montesquieu, these should be separate branches of government, but the king is trying to dabble and control it. And that's what's happening. So he kicks out Wilkes. Right? Now, what happens later in 1768, Wilkes comes back to England. He's re-elected to Parliament, guys. He gets re-elected once, and guess what? George III convinces his allies in the House of Commons to refuse to seat him. So they do another election. He gets elected again. They do 3 elections, and he gets elected all 3 times. Bottom line is the people want John Wilkes. And John Wilkes is becoming a symbol of the people, right? And George III and the House of Commons that are expelling him are a symbol of everything that is wrong with Great Britain. Well, bottom line is there were political demonstrations that broke out all over England. And finally, in 1774, when the American Revolution was kind of in its early stages, he's finally seated. So think about all of this is going on during the American Revolution. And guess who's listening? Guess who's watching? The United States, all right? The American colonies. As a matter of fact, guys, here's a teapot from the American colonies. Wilkes and Liberty, number 45. 45, guys, was the issue that he criticized King George III. So they're even making teapots in the American Revolution about John Wilkes. So Americans just viewed this like, look, if you need any evidence that the British government is corrupt and Parliament's corrupted by King George III, look what's going on with John Wilkes. Okay? Look at the corruption that's keeping him out of government even though he was elected. So according to the American colonies, John Wilkes' example was a reason why George III and Parliament were corrupt and they needed to break away. So there's another reason, guys, that's going on in the American intellectuals' minds about breaking away from Great Britain. Pause if you need to. Okay, aftermath of the American Revolution. Aftermath is like, hey, what happens next? What happens in the wake of the war that was left by the American Revolution? Well, guys, Great Britain lost some of their most valuable colonies, all right? And I'm not going to really get into it now, but I'll get into it in a little bit later in another chapter, guys. But it didn't really hurt Great Britain as much as you think, okay? And we'll talk about that in a second. But bottom line is, Great Britain lost a huge chunk of their empire and some of their most valuable colonies. Now, here's the deal. People in Great Britain kind of realized things needed to change. The whole incident with John Wilkes kind of showed that there was corruption in Parliament and that Parliament members are being bribed and controlled by the king, and that's not a good thing. So, like I said, even in general, though, let's be honest, Parliament in Great Britain was controlled by the wealthy. There weren't poor people, guys, in Parliament. Even if you were in the House of Commons, you were wealthy and well off. And a lot of people began to think in Great Britain that Parliament didn't do what it was supposed to do, which is represent the interests of all British people. I mean, think about the Americans. They've been screaming that for years. We're not represented. You can't tax us because we're not represented. And a lot of British people heard these cries from across the Atlantic and they sympathized with it. They thought, you know what? There's something to be made about that. So the American Revolution in the minds of the British showed the people of Great Britain that, hey, you could go above and beyond the government and set up your own constitutional bodies. Look at the Stamp Act Congress, right? When Great Britain tried to enforce a law that the Americans or tax Americans disagreed with, what did they do? They formed a legitimate body that organized the colonies to do a boycott. Look at the Constitutional Convention. After the American Revolution, all the colonies get together. We didn't talk about this, but all the colonies get together and they're like, look, we need to write a constitution. And they all hammered it out and hashed it out, and they wrote the Constitution that we still have today. So what they showed that it could be done. All right? So guys, in 1778, a guy named Henry Wivell creates this thing called the Yorkshire Association or the Yorkshire Association. And what this was, guys, was it was a whole bunch of reform means change, right? A bunch of reform-minded Englishmen that get together and they say, look, what needs to be done about Parliament? How can we reform Parliament? Now, it was largely made up of property owners, wealthy people still. And guys, I'm not going to lie, for a very long time, the government is going to be in the hands of wealthy people. It's not going to be till the late 1800s that you start to get more lower people on the social hierarchy, like common workers, that are going to get voting rights. So anyway, it was made up of property owners, and their goal was they wanted to try to reform Parliament and eliminate patronage and limit royal power. Those were the things that they wanted to do. They said, look, the king and Parliament the king should not control Parliament. No members of Parliament should be under the influence of the king. Everything should be separate. Now, did it work? Not exactly. Okay, why? Well, guys, because George III is able to appoint a really smart and powerful royal minister, William Pitt the Younger, the son of the William Pitt that was the royal minister during the French and Indian War. And William Pitt the Younger, guys, is going to be the royal minister. And what William Pitt the Younger is going to do is he's going to get into the minds of the public, and he's going to create a more positive image of George III. And basically, all of this thing is going to blow over for a little bit, and he's able to reassert the king's influence in Parliament. But what you do get with Christopher Wivell and the Yorkshire Association is you do get this beginning of an acknowledgement that something's got to be done. Now, in later chapters, you're going to see the British are going to take on this idea of something's going to be done. And over the course of the 1800s, you're slowly going to see Parliament become more and more powerful and the king or queen become less and less powerful. All right? Pause if you need to. So I guess you could say the American Revolution showed the British that they too needed to change. Now, the very last thing I want to talk about is just the impact of the American Revolution. What really happened at the end of the American Revolution? Well, guys, I'm not going to lie. The Revolution showed the world that a government could be created without a king, the government could be created without ancient nobles, or any part of the ancien regime. All right, the old regime. So basically, the American Revolution showed the world, hey, we don't have to have nobles and clergy and 3 estates and the ancien regime. We don't have to have that. You can make a government based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, based on the ideas of equality, based on the ideas of democracy. You can do that. Now, the problem is, guys, at first, America is not going to be great at implementing those ideas, but we have those ideas as our basis. So you could replace the ancien regime, kings and nobles, with constitutions. Popular consent. What that means is you can rule by the consent of the governed. You can rule by people voting for their best interests. Okay? So you replace these old things with these new things. Okay? Now, aristocratic ideals, the old ideals of the nobility that controlled Europe for so long, are going to be replaced with democratic ideals. Democracy, guys, means rule of the many, the majority, the people, ideally. But I'd be lying if I told you that right when America became the United States, they had good democracy. Because, guys, for a very long time, all the way through the 1820s, only landowners could vote in the United States. And in the 1820s, guys, they had this thing called universal male suffrage, and males were able to vote. Now, white males were the majority of people able to vote, which means, guys, a lot of free African American men in the United States are not going to have the right to vote. But we'll talk about that a little bit later, okay? Another thing that the American Revolution did was it put out these ideas that, hey, you know what? Social status, all right, all that stuff shouldn't be based on birth or inheritance, all right? From now on, you shouldn't be a high member of society just because of your family or your nobility. It should be based on your merit. But like I said, guys, this mostly applied to terms of white men. Because one of the things, guys, that the United States did not do in the American Revolution is they didn't free their slaves. They didn't give political rights to women or Native Americans. So although the United States is going to purport these ideals of life, liberty, and property, everyone is created equal, it's going to take a very long time for them to fully implement these ideas. And today, in 2023, we're still implementing them. So the American Revolution changed the world's mind on what could be. Guys, that's the end of the notes. I'll see you tomorrow in class.